in international development here at CRED, the Center for International Research, Education and Development at Virginia Tech. We're part of Outreach and International Affairs. And I want to introduce Lumbini Barua, who you see up there with that same beautiful backdrop that she put together for us. She's my graduate assistant, a PhD student in the School of Education here. So welcome to the virtual Women and Gender in International Development discussion series. This is our second event this academic year, and we're very happy you could all join us for Dr. Hale Tufan's presentation and discussion. This event is co-sponsored by CALS Global at Virginia Tech and the Women and Minority Artists and Scholars Lecture Series, also at Virginia Tech through the Office of the Provost. So as of this morning, we had 48 people registered for today's event. Zoom is a fickle thing. It's very easy to register. We never have all the people that sign up actually show up, but we'll see who will. But of those people, it was a very diverse group, including people from Bangladesh, Canada, India, Kenya, Mexico, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And of course, people also in the United States. So welcome to everybody. Please note that our event will be recorded and available on our website later, a couple weeks later. So by staying on now, you are consenting to being recorded. If you don't want your image included, you can close down your image, turn off your camera. The full calendar and any updates are available on our website for the WGD discussion series. Lumbini will surely that she already put it in. Of course, she's ahead of me. So before introducing our speaker, I invite you to reflect on Virginia Tech's land and labor recognition statement. So Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutelo-Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. Now, we understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutelo-Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous student, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. And we must also recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through Inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to UTPROSM that I may serve, in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. Some housekeeping notes. This discussion will last approximately 45 minutes. Our speaker's presentation will be 20 to 25 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A. You're welcome to post any questions at any time in the chat box because we put them into a Google Doc and I will read from them later. So as your questions come up, feel free to put them in. If we run out of the questions that people have written to the chat box, I will ask for people to raise their hands and ask questions or engage in discussion with our speaker. So in order for our discussion to be as rich as it can be, we need everyone to be respectful and treat all participants with kindness and consideration without discriminatory behavior. So again, we're being recorded and you will have access to it via our website. Okay. So in advance, I beg of you to please fill out the survey that you get a link to at the end. It's very important to us to raise funds and to help us with planning as well as fundraising. And you can tweet us by tagging us at, and there Lumbini is going to put that in, at WGD_VT. Okay, now what you really are here for. I'm going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Hale Tufan is an associate professor in Cornell University's School of Integrative Plant Science and very active in international research for development projects. In her work with plant breeders, social scientists, and research institutions, Tufan explores how agricultural research processes and outputs can positively contribute to gender equality and social inclusion. Through her research to develop methods and approaches, she enables gender plus analysis in agricultural innovation while advocating for inclusive agricultural research, by challenging power and norms in the research ecosystem. Her work focuses on building gender-responsive crop improvement systems through curriculum development and training, leading research on priority setting, market research, gender research, and on-farm testing. She is the priority setting co-lead for the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement, also a principal investigator of the Gender Responsive Researchers Equipped for Agricultural Transformation, known as GREAT, a principal investigator for the Muhura Bora Cassava for All, survey division lead for the Next Gen Cassava Project, and a gender research lead of the Feed the Future Insect Resistance Eggplant Partnership. She was awarded the Borlaug Field Award in 2019 to recognize her work to ensure women farmers and researchers are fairly represented in agricultural research for development. And the title of her talk today is Beyond Women's Traits, Analyzing Gender and Social Differences for Inclusive Crop Varietal Design. Please welcome Dr. Hale Tufan.
Thank you so much, Maria Lisa. Very nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to give this talk. Welcome, everyone. So I don't need to introduce myself more, but today I'll just go over very quickly what I'll be talking about. So as a brief outline, there's so much to talk about in this space. It was really hard to narrow down, but I'll do a brief introduction of gender and technology development just to set the scene. You know, how does this work get situated in that broader context? Talk a little bit about the gendered science of crop improvement and what that means. And then highlight basically kind of 2 or 3 different sets of work that map to that. One is the power dynamics in crop breeding teams, and talk a little bit about methods around cassava traits and adoptions and seed systems. So knowing this is a diverse audience, I thought I would start with my favorite story, and that is this crash test dummy. So meet the 50th percentile crash test dummy. The reason I'm raising this is in all crash simulations globally, the body of the 50th percentile male from the 1970s in the US is used as the norm. What that means is the body of this man is what's being used in all crash test simulations globally, had been used. And what does that mean? That means that the male body is normative. And that results in women being 70% more likely to be seriously injured in car crashes globally. And I'm raising this just to say, when we think about this gender and technology development, gender and technology more broadly, there's so many poignant stories like this crash test dummy that really positions men as being the norm, especially North American men being the norm, especially in health sciences and technology development. And another example that I like to highlight as an introduction is this book by Caroline Criado Perez, you may have read, called Invisible Women. And here she talks about data gaps and heart attack symptoms. This is kind of a second example. If we think about gender and technology, gender and health, what we know is common heart attack symptoms, kind of on the left here, are common for women and men. So the crushing chest pain, the sweating, the nausea, the radiating pain. But what we don't talk about and physicians don't talk about often enough are these specific symptoms that women experience: fatigue, shortness of breath, flu-like symptoms. And again, as she really poignantly describes in her book, what's happening is, and I'll just quote from her book because I think she puts it so well, "Only now it turned out that our cultural positioning of men as the default humans was corrupting science. And as a result, women were dying because, again, women are more likely to die of heart attacks than men because their symptoms, the common symptoms they're experiencing, are not recognized." So over and over again, really in 3 slides summarizing decades of work, what we're seeing, and for those of you more interested in this space, I'm going to kind of forward you to this website called Gender Innovations out of Stanford. There's many case studies really documenting this bias in health, technology, engineering, environment, the systematic bias that really causes our science to be incomplete. And there's been big movements, especially I would say in health and technology, to change this, right? So at this day and age, as we're thinking about, kind of maybe 10, 20, 30 years of shifts and changes in the space and the documentation, even there's an editorial in Nature from about 3 years ago that says, unless you consider sex and gender analysis in health interventions, it's not good science. So as I'm reading all of this and we're looking at the landscape of how things are changing around agriculture and agricultural research, what we really see is plant breeding is a little bit behind, or agricultural innovation is a little bit behind, to put it mildly. And basically the same concepts of the gendered science and the gendered health science, the gender technology, really does apply to crop improvement as well. So I'm going to title this The Gendered Science of Crop Improvement, and go a little bit through what that exactly means. So starting this section again with a quote, and I quote this because Rex Bernardo is, I would say, currently one of the lead thinkers in plant breeding, and is really theoretically strong and kind of influences a lot of the plant breeding thinking, especially in North America. And he describes in one of his big publications about plant breeding and the latest status of plant breeding is the genetic improvement of plants for human benefit. And I think that's compelling because the word human is applied here, yet we spend probably not enough time really thinking for which humans and what kind of benefit. So really unpacking the assumption that underlies, and a lot of the gendered assumptions that underlie which humans and what kind of benefit is really what we're trying to do in a lot of our analysis and work. So can we talk about the gendered science of plant breeding? And there's not a lot of work out there. Those of you not familiar, I included a definition of science and technology studies here because I realize that may not be familiar to everyone, but really taking a critical look at the science of plant breeding using a more STS lens. So STS is an interdisciplinary field that really examines creation, development, and consequences of science and technology. It really posits that they're situated in historical, cultural, and social contexts. So really, in essence, thinking about how and who carries out research really impacts the design, especially of agricultural innovations in this case. Taking an STS lens to plant breeding is fairly new. It's an emerging field, I would say, but there's an older example from Ann Ferguson in Michigan State from 1995, looking at bean improvement from a project in Malawi. So what she saw there was really critically examining the process of bean improvement in this project. And she saw, first of all, that there were really gendered assumptions around the distribution of farmers' knowledge. So the scientists themselves were making these assumptions around who held knowledge about beans within farming households. Then that was followed by kind of assuming or accepting or deciding that the knowledge of men farmers was superior to that of women farmers. So kind of this is the process that she's documenting. As a result, of course, the information that they're gathering was biased. They're gathering more information from men. And this is quite classic in this field, I would say, and is changing rapidly, but this is just kind of a nice way to lay it out. And subsequently influenced the initial proposals for plant breeding strategies that resulted. So really you see this kind of causal effect of having that initial gendered assumption and bias that was held by those breeders and those scientists, and how that really carried through the whole process, all the way to the decisions they were making and priorities they were setting around their plant breeding strategies. So this is one example where you can kind of end at those decisions being made, but the so what happens after that? What are the implications of that? And I would say, again, there's not a lot of systematic documentation of the after effects of being, quote unquote, gender blind or not considering these systematic biases in project design and implementation. But there's one example to me that stands out that I think is quite nice in a way that it really documents from start to end, is the story of Nerica rice. This is the work of Johanna Bergman-Loden from 2012. And Nerica rice is a new type of rice variety that was really developed by international research centers and released, in this case, in Uganda. So this is kind of a case study from Uganda. So what they saw was, of course, these Nerica rice varieties were yielding higher, and they documented initially the household income gains from adopting this rice. So these are household level gains, that they were seeing higher incomes from adopting households. But what she then did was layer that with a much more qualitative in-depth study to say, is that true? Are there different individuals within the households experiencing different effects from that adoption? And what she documents is really interesting, because this new type of rice variety, the Nerica rice, was a lot more susceptible to bird infestation. And as simple as that may sound, what was happening was she was documenting birds were attacking these rice varieties a lot, significantly more than they were the kind of traditional varieties grown by these farmers. And as a result, women and children were having to spend a big portion of their day chasing away these birds, right? So then she's documenting this exacerbation of time poverty, drudgery that went with that, and really kind of preventing the formation of their social and human capitals because they were spending so much time on managing these fields. And here I just want to pause to say in plant breeding and crop improvement spaces, this kind of critical analysis of the gendered nature of the research, as well as the consequences of that, is still pretty much in its infancy, because as you can see, we're still looking at this at least do no harm level of don't make these mistakes, so you're adversely affecting the adopters of these new varieties. And having said that, plant breeding is also rapidly changing. So the examples I'm showing are probably more from public sector plant breeding, food security oriented crops, more agricultural research for development and plant breeding therein. What's happening over the last 5 years to this plant breeding space, again, this is more for agricultural research for development plant breeding, is that it's becoming really shifted towards what's called the business of plant breeding. So you see a lot of the adoption, and this is somewhat donor driven, the adoption of a lot more industry, North American plant breeding, large multinationals, and how they approach the business of plant breeding has kind of infiltrated these small public sector food security breeding programs. And we can go into depth about 2 hours on this topic alone, but I'm raising this because it's changing the context within which we're doing these analyses and actually directly affects it. What does this mean in practice? I'm kind of drawing from a presentation here of this adaptive process. This is a modified version of Syngenta seed stage plan. What this means is Syngenta is a kind of giant multinational seed company. This is how they develop their new varieties. Again, commercial European US sector. So this is a process which they follow. And what's happened over the last kind of 5 to 7 years is this process has been, quote unquote, adapted to public sector programs. What you're seeing here is kind of a sequential product design, development, release, and management cycle. And this makes a lot of sense for kind of the context that it's been developed in, where you have a lot of market research, right? So companies really approach this as an investment decision. They look at the commercialization, they look at the seed sales, they make decisions on investing into or away from a variety that they may be designing, mostly based on their market research. So that's why I've kind of circled this here. But the interesting thing is, what does market research mean? In the origins of this thinking, it's seed sales. So you can track to see how successful your variety is in the market. But that's a problem, because this is a review from 2019, again, by pretty prominent breeders, I would say publicly accepting the flaws in some of this thinking by saying, in the private sector, breeding programs, numbers of units sold or market share are common metrics of success. But such information is difficult to obtain for public sector programs, particularly in developing countries, and comes with the added socioeconomic complication of calculating who benefits and how equitably, and how the benefits are equitably distributed. So I'm raising this just to say there's this giant shift in the plant breeding space, and I won't go into the depths of it for those of you interested. I'm just going to flag this paper, kind of taking a critical look at these shifts and how this concept of demand in markets has infiltrated this world. But the second point I want to make here is that because there's an absence of market data or market intelligence, as it's sometimes called in the public sector, what's happening is this thinking and this shift is really leading to social scientists and gender researchers being tapped more heavily by breeding programs. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit in the next sections, because there's this hunger for market data, and the understanding of that is so different that you really need to design de novo research to understand what are the market demands and forces and what that even looks like in an informal seed system for food security crop is a whole nother discussion. But looking at this, what I'm seeing in some of these programs, and this is work of the Next Gen Cassava project, is the social scientists coming into this core team of breeding can create some problems because suddenly you have interdisciplinary teams working together. You have your economists with your social scientists, with your breeders. And the idea that you can put all these people in a room and they'll cohesively make equitable decisions together is a big assumption. So I think that's kind of slowly being revealed. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But to circumvent a little bit of that joint decision making, you see, again, some industry thinking coming in here to say, how do we make decisions? Can we think of decision rights? So these are also not just the frameworks, but the processes from industry coming in. So what you're seeing in some of these programs, and I'm pulling this out from a report, this is kind of this team, this breeding team, particularly in West Africa for cassava, is listing different standardized disciplines that would be involved in decision-making for plant breeding, right? And this is to decide to progress or not along a product development pipeline. So everything is changing in how these teams are being constructed, how they're working together. And what you're seeing is there's probably, I would say for the first time, a formal list of disciplines, but also what's called decision rights. This was kind of a consultant from private sector coming in and talking about how can we bring in decision rights mapping. And the D means an ultimate decision maker, and anyone with an A is someone who has to agree to that decision before it can progress. And it's interesting to see here, for example, that you see gender and social sciences. The market economist is the decider. The gender social scientist person, who's presumably in the room, has a veto right, right? So you really have this formalization of roles, formalization of teams, and how they're supposed to function together. And this is kind of a fascinating space in other projects too. So next I'll shift to looking at this question of how do you bring all these different disciplines into a room to make a decision together in a very complicated setting. So it's this question that drove us, and this is the Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement. I won't go into the depth of the project, but to say we're a Feed the Future Innovation Lab based at Cornell. We have different crop mandates, and we work in 4 centers of innovation, as we call them, across 5 countries. Our website has very in-depth information on all the programs and all the work we do. But I'm bringing this up to show you, we're walking across many different programs, many different crops, and the center, kind of the idea of this program is, quote unquote, improving the breeding efficiency, right? The process. So we have phenomics people, we have genomics people, we have informatics people that do kind of the backstopping for the breeding. But we also have a group that works on what's called priority setting and cross-cutting issues. And we really look at this question of how do these programs set their breeding priorities? Coming back to that first column that I just showed you, how do you decide what's important? How do you understand what demand is and what's kind of impactful before you even start the breeding process? And a lot of these programs, are national. These are all national programs in all of these countries. And the presence of social scientists in their teams is quite thin. And I would say mostly economists that do adoption studies historically. And onto these teams, we're layering further complications, saying don't just think about your breeding priorities, but think about impact. So we're bringing what are called the cross-cutting issues. This is led by Deborah Rubin and her team there as a part of the Innovation Lab, really saying how can you set priorities that don't just look at productivity and yield, but bring in resilience, gender equality, nutrition, youth, inclusion. I'm bringing this up to say these teams are often, loaded with a lot of information and a lot of different new topics that they really hadn't traditionally handled. And I'm just going to stop here to say that, can cause a little bit of disruption, because I think we don't often think about power dynamics in these breeding teams. So as we're bringing some of these topics in and specialists who specialize in those topics into these core teams that have worked kind of in isolation together autonomously, there can, of course, be ensuing power dynamics and struggles and what that looks like for interdisciplinarity. And I want to say it's what no one really wants to talk about, because there's this assumption that you put everyone in a room and everything works great. So I see a lot of this kind of sugar coating of the interdisciplinarity in plant breeding and how that's changing and improving things without really looking at the critical dynamics of what may be happening with these shifts. And why am I asking about power? Many of you may or may not be familiar with the gender dimensions framework developed by Cultural Practice and D, who's involved in our team and their work over the kind of last decade or more. And really the reason is you look at gender-based constraints and opportunities in ag research for development, let's say specifically, there are multiple dimensions that come into play: beliefs, perceptions, access to assets, practices, institutions, laws, and policies. All of these really apply to a lot of the interdisciplinary teams that we're talking about. And the center of all of those kind of different dimensions that cause gender-based constraints to manifest is power. So we really want to bring this thinking to our examination of the power dynamics within some of these plant breeding themes. So really borrowing some of this broader thinking. And really asking, if we're looking at priority setting and how teams set priorities in an interdisciplinary manner, we have to be honest to say, we know there are different priorities at play. We know there's different dynamics at play, and the nexus of all that coming together really is not a well thought out process. So as this kind of pilot project, we asked the question, how do power dynamics and breeding teams and institutions affect interdisciplinary, and specifically the voice of social scientists? For this work, we're working with two consultants, Beth Cullen and Catherine Snyder, who are really digging deep into power theory, looking at power dynamics and interdisciplinarity. So I'm pulling this slide from a literature review they prepared on the topic, and just pointing out some high-level bullets of what is known, what is out there, what has been documented in this space. What we do know is institutional arrangements do not promote interdisciplinary collaboration. Scientists are often rewarded for scientific outputs and not interdisciplinary collaboration. It's just not set into the promotion and kind of structures of most institutions, especially national ag research institutions. We also know that hierarchies among and preconceived ideas about other disciplines can affect collaboration and integration of knowledge. What does that mean? I see this all the time in the work that we do, that kind of there's this preconceived notion of what qualitative gender research may look like, how valid it is, how is it generated, is it scientific? There's all these kind of very loaded ideas and biases. And again, the power still lies with a lot of the time with the breeders, and they're able to take or not on board some of the ideas and thinking coming out of these spaces. And part of that is also kind of how disciplines are perceived. And there's some documentation of social science more broadly within the CG, for example, of being perceived as service providers, right? This is the usual, the last minute people going to researchers who may have experience in gender research and saying, can you write me my gender paragraph? Or can you do this little study? And with little to no funding. So really not looking at these disciplines and scientists on the teams as producing relevant, standalone, strong science, but really just service providers. So again, these are existing things from the literature that we're pulling out here. And at the end of the day, what does this mean? That these disciplinary hierarchies really reflect who sets the research agenda, who's defining the research questions, and who's allocating the budgets. And the answer to a lot of those in plant breeding is clear, right? It's still really dominated by plant breeding teams. And how do you actually look at this? Because we know that these hierarchies especially are more strongly felt if you're a woman social scientist in these breeding teams. Again, this has been documented as the double marginalization, right? In the agricultural sector, we know it's historically been male dominated. And this great paper by Farrell and Rickards calling it deeply masculinized and shaped by Anglo-male scientists. So this is kind of the history of agricultural research manifesting itself. But for social scientists who may also be women in these spaces, who may be gender experts specifically, the struggle to make their disciplinary perspectives heard is really difficult. And Verma et al. In 2010 really called this the double marginalization in terms of power, decision-making, and access to resources. So we're taking all this background ideas and saying, okay, drawing on what's known in these interdisciplinary teams, drawing on, we know, the gendered basis of plant breeding and how science is gendered itself and contextual and situated. We're kind of taking some of the power theory and applying it through research, primary research with breeding teams, but also doing some power mapping to say, how is power felt? How is power operating? How is it manifesting, right? And using the Scaventus power cube, Beth and Catherine are really digging deep to unpack various dimensions that may be felt by these breeding teams. So watch this space. I'm not going to be presenting results at this stage from this work, but just to say this is an area of really intense interest as, again, the field is shifting and plant breeding is becoming more interdisciplinary, and that is being much more formalized. At this point, I'm going to shift gears a little bit because the title of my talk is Beyond Women's Traits, and I'm going to talk a little bit about especially methodologies. So once you get these breeding teams together, interdisciplinary teams together, what kind of information do they generate that the plant breeding decisions are made based on? So kind of taking away the kind of unclarity or the theoretical aspect of that and really demonstrating what we're talking about when we're generating some of this knowledge. So I'll take the work from Cassava and the Next Gen Cassava project and talk a little bit about traits, but also adoption. So this is a methodology that we developed for the Next Gen Cassava project. And the idea here is it's not enough just to kind of do a survey to understand traits and trait preferences, right? That there's a lot more complex research that we need to do. And by all means, this is not perfect, but we're trying to cover all different bases. So the first set of work that we did, and this is the work of around 6-7 years now, is do a lot more qualitative work together with what's called the RTB Foods project to do, what in that project is called gendered food mapping. So really understanding kind of the product movement and who's involved and how, but also taking really qualitative data at those stages for what an ideal cassava variety would look like. So this is mostly qualitative information, and I'm giving some quotes here from what's emerging in that work. We then move on to add more quantitative layers to this to say, okay, if we can hone in on 8 to 10 traits and characteristics that are really emerging from the qualitative work and understand who is prioritizing what traits and how, really generating what we're calling typologies. And we published some of this work, but not only looking at the different traits, but adding a layer of this Roma survey. This is kind of a sociodemographic survey developed by IATA to start pulling apart more nuanced social identities and how those may be driving the trait preferences. And as a last step, not just kind of doing the descriptor work and the typology, but then seeing what happens on farm when we offer respondents choices of different varieties. How are they making those choices of adoption or not? So I'm going to really briefly present 2 or 3 slides on the kind of work they were doing in this space to really bring it home. Lo and behold, and not surprising, we know that social differences drive trait preferences. And what I like in this kind of work that we've done is we haven't just done the binary. You see a lot of literature on men versus women in terms of trait preferences in many different crops in many different countries. We wanted to move beyond that. And for that, we employed this Roma survey that allows you to not just kind of disaggregate your trait preference data. What you're seeing along the bottom here, these are different cassava traits: taste, texture, color, swelling. But we're looking at the top, we have the sex disaggregation, and then we also have disaggregation by poverty level, food insecurity status, and region. And the reason why we've shown those 4 axes is kind of we did preliminary analysis to see where the greatest differences were or kind of correlations with choices around traits. What this allows you to do, and for a breeding program, this is compelling because you don't just present national level data to say men want this and women want that, which is not really useful for them to think in a binary sense. And it's not useful for us to present that data as such because it really oversimplifies. We're able to start pulling out, especially we see in Nigeria for cassava, where this data is coming from, you see huge regional differences in trait preferences. So we can start saying women in the Southeast who are in poor but food, insecure households, these are the different priorities of traits. Likewise, in the South for non-poor, food insecure. So you can start pulling out much more nuanced trait level data. And this is interesting for programs because as they're deciding on what to breed for, they have a lot more granularity on the kind of data that we're presenting to them. They can be much more intentional about their design decisions. Layered on top of this, we also do a lot of kind of the gendered food mapping work, which is really kind of looking at who's involved where and how along kind of value chains for cassava in Nigeria. And we can look at the on-farm data to see who's adopting what kind of crop or cassava variety. This is a very complicated graph on the right, so take it with a grain of salt, but the bottom line is the value chain role and gender together drive trait or drive varietal preferences. What does that mean? The choice of adopting one of these many different varieties is that we've presented as options to farmers using the tri-crop method. Interestingly, the most significant kind of bifurcation in the data, what that means, the most significant differences are not by the sex of the farmer growing the crop, but who they're selling to. And that's a really compelling new kind of piece of information because it's something we hadn't thought about before. We always look at the sex of the farmer and who's growing the crop, but we don't really think what happens next. So what we're seeing is there's more kind of variability in the data explained by who that person, who you're passing your product on to, than who's actually doing the growing. So we're really, again, trying to tease out some of this nuance to say, you get differences in types of varieties chosen based on who you are and who you're interacting with along the value chain. Again, we can start presenting this to breeding programs so they can understand how to make some of these choices. And lastly, this is really interesting work that we recently submitted looking at who do you ask about what and how really matters. And this is data that we've mined from a study that's about 7 years old now about cassava adoption in Nigeria again. So really what we're showing here is this is all publicly available data that we went back through and analyzed. And the top row here is looking at all plots and how much cassava is grown on those plots. And we had interviews with husbands and wives kind of from the same households pulled together. What you see there's kind of significant differences in reporting of how much cassava is grown between men and women and which one of those plots is managed by men or women, right? So there's a disagreement within the household about how much cassava is grown or if cassava is grown on those plots and who's managing them. And the interesting part here is the plots with improved varieties. There was a specific question on, do you grow improved cassava varieties? You see the same thing. So what does this mean? What this means is there's a over or under reporting, depending on how you look at it, of how many plots or how much of the plots managed by women are growing improved cassava varieties, and vice versa with men. And again, what that means methodologically is traditionally, if you look at adoption studies, and a lot of adoption studies ask the head of the household for what kind of varieties they're growing. What you see here is there's a significant disagreement within a household about adoption or not. So again, this really raised a flag for us to say, well, what does this mean for our methods that we're employing for adoption? Could we think about how we could modify or improve them? And again, methodologically looking at this, some of the trait preference data I showed you, we did, similar kind of intra-household work there, where we asked men and women within the same household, husbands and wives, these were kind of dual-headed households, what kind of trait preferences they had. So we had the rankings of the different traits. What we did was have those interviews individually and then have them joint to see, how do things change in a joint interview versus the individual interviews. And we used a trait ranking method called 1000 Minds. And what you see here is on the left, these are the different traits going down the middle here. And on the left, you have what the ranking was for women individually, women, the wives and the husbands on the right, and what happens in joint interviews. And what you see is kind of an averaging out. So in the joint interviews, a lot of the movement away from the more, let's say, extremes of the ranking really ended up being enmeshed kind of to averaging to a mean. And that was interesting to us because our initial hypothesis was in a joint setting, in a joint interview, would the men's preferences be more dominant, right? Would this end number of the negotiated preference be closer to the men's preferences? And that's not what we're seeing. So again, just to say here, we're doing a lot of methodological work to improve the types of data that we're getting and refining the methods and how we're rolling out those methods to get some of this information. So kind of concluding this part of my talk and thinking about what this all means for the field, I just like to end on this call, I would say, for a paradigm shift. And I'm calling it a paradigm shift because I think we've had a lot of safe discussions around gender integration into plant breeding, without really talking about the heart of it, which is really looking at critically examining these research processes and using some feminist SDS lenses and really starting to say, how can we improve the processes? How can we start talking about structural inequalities and power and really flip the paradigm? And what that means is, instead of thinking about integrating gender into breeding goals, which is what we do now on this kind of blue arrow to your left, is we do gender analysis within plant breeding frameworks, right? We do the sex disaggregated data, everything that I've just shown you. In fact, can we think about the reverse? How can we integrate plant breeding outputs really to contribute towards gender equality goals? So how do plant breeding products themselves become an instrument towards gender equality goals? And this is a shift of thinking that really requires us to look to see how we're doing research and understand some of the dynamics that I was talking about earlier in this. So to give enough time for discussion, I will stop there and be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hale. Okay, so I don't see questions in the chat box right now. And I feel like the questions that I prepare in advance are exactly what your presentation was about. So I'm going to ask part of one of them because it's just more like specific. So, okay. So I've been working in this position as director of, used to be called Women in Development, then Gender in Development, for 16 years. And so as we know, gender and I work on proposals that we write now, and we know that gender and social inclusion is a requirement now for pretty much all projects funded by international donors, as women's participation has been in USAID and other funded projects for over 20 years. But often PIs and the teams in ag and other projects see this, as you said, call the person in or provide the service, do the paragraph. So as a box to check and something that competes with precious funding, right? Because we don't have funding, so let's cut out the gender component. And I mean the funding to actually do work in the field, which actually does cost money, just like the other work costs money. So what are some strategies that you have used, that you learned, that can get beyond this? And like actually, because I've done 4-day workshops, I've been on field trips with plant scientists, and then at the end, somebody will make a comment that it's just like, oh my God, has nothing really gotten into them? Like, well, you know, Maria Lisa, I kind of feel like you're trying to change their culture by addressing gender, as opposed to changing their culture by addressing crop preferences or whatever. Anyway, that's my big question. That's my big question. Yes. And then Larry has raised his hand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a perfect answer to that. So how we've approached that question, at least with ILSI, and, you know, I've learned a lot in that process as well. So in our RFP and choosing some of these centers of innovation that I talked about in these 5 countries, we really had a strong, and, you know, again, like you're saying, it's a strong requirement to have skilled analysts on the team, right? And we tried to stick to that. So we really reviewed CVs, we really looked through that. I would say, despite all of that effort and ring fencing of funding, that's another thing, budgets, huge contentious issue. And there's still an issue, even where we had ring fencing of those budgets within those broader centers, right? We asked that budget be put aside, that budget gets reallocated. So we're seeing that over and over again. I would say, I mean, at this point, it's really hard to answer what's worked well or not. One thing I'm seeing that's worked very well, actually, and this is something I don't have enough evidence on, but it's anecdotal, is have an equivalent levels and hierarchy and positions for a social and biophysical scientist to co-lead. We have one team, for example, where that's the case. So you have 2 faculty members from a university, both professors, both kind of very well established, both are kind of at the same level, let's say, quote unquote. They're co-leading one of those centers. That has been very different than a situation where you have a breeder leading and you have a social scientist on the team. And that's the power differential and the hierarchy that kind of raise these questions that we're asking. Can we pull out some of that in the interviews? So what I'm thinking now, if I had to redo some of that work, I don't know how you would put that as a condition, because a lot of the centers don't have positions that are equivalent. Your breeders are often in much higher level positions, decision making. You know, your economists are kind of relegated, even if there are social scientists. So it's not something we can replicate, but in 2 different instances with a great program and ILSI, that has been probably by far the explanatory factor for where teams do really interesting work and really come together, is when we've had that high level engagement, right? The social scientist is at the similar level. I mean, the one thing with the budgeting that you said, one lesson that opened my eyes from the power dynamics work and some of the interviews, we're seeing narratives around, I didn't even know how to budget for this, from the social scientists, right? I was put under pressure. I had to prepare something for this proposal. I didn't even know how to start budgeting for the kind of work that we were doing. Right. And what happened is I under budgeted and now I'm in trouble. So what I've learned from there is, you know, maybe even some help with some of those social scientists in these breeding teams in this particular context to say, you know, is your budgeting and planning realistic? Because that's when things went south in some of those teams where they didn't have enough money to really complete what they needed to. They couldn't tap into the other resources. And the training piece is really important, but I see that more as a long haul engagement. I don't really see it as short term. That when I've seen some of these breeders really become champions, it's been 5 years of work, really diligently, slowly working with them. I don't think we can expect workshops to do that. It's really kind of a much longer term, and that just means we need to keep reminding and engaging with them and not just say, okay, they're done, right? They've had their gender training. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Larry, go ahead and unmute yourself. And
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Splendid presentation. A lot to think about. And if you had presented the question of power dynamics before you presented the decision rights, I would think you are setting up the question and then here's the solution, decision rights table. It explains the power dynamics, it controls power imbalances, it fixes things. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So tell us a little bit more about how well the decision rights tables do work. What are their limitations? Are there ways to use them more effectively than you've seen them used? Or what part of the solution are they not a part of, and what can they actually help us with?
That's a really good question.
But Larry, introduce yourself first. And I'm sorry, and I was going to write a note to everybody. Introduce yourself when you ask questions. So go ahead, Larry, please.
I'm Larry Vaughn, and I work with Maria Lisa at Virginia Tech Center for International Research
For many years.
For many years. There's just one small office between the two of us, separating the two of us.
Okay. Okay, I think the decision rights work is about 6 months old. So I don't think we're ready to evaluate the effectiveness of it. Having said that, watching how that process unfolded, I was kind of an insider-outsider watching these discussions as not someone facilitating them, but really observing them. I did see several pitfalls that could possibly come from it. And again, I'm just going out on a leap of faith here. It may turn out differently. What I was seeing is often the people who were tagged with some of these job categories, especially the gender specialist, socioeconomics person, some safe choices were made who was put into that position. So I think the system itself is kind of what do you call it? The deck is kind of stacked in the right way, right? So I see a lot of choices being made saying, oh, here's our gender specialist, check. They're on the team. They have a decision right. They're probably going to vote with me no matter what. So I don't see it as fixing the problem, because who's actually overseeing who's being put into these positions. You wouldn't ever dream of a what can I put, like a biotechnologist being put in a breeding position, and that would be fine, but you see a lot for the gender positions, right? You see someone who has any relevance for any gender research or has gone to a gender training once, they're suddenly your gender person on the team. So Larry, I don't think it fixes it. I don't think it addresses the power dynamics when you do have qualified individuals making their cases. But in that particular case, I think it's more about making safe choices and really making sure that the people on that list are not going to veto or challenge, right? Again, I don't know if that's how it'll play out, but I know the people involved and I see that that's what's happening basically.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Go ahead and raise your hands if anybody here. I know we have a lot of people here with a lot of experience because I know some of you. So we have about 6 minutes left. So love to get a hand. I don't see any. Larry, did you really raise your hand again?
I did. If no one's going to jump in, I want to take 2 turns in a row.
Okay, go ahead.
Because,
Oh, and then Sierra.
oh, I didn't mean to jump in front of someone, but
Okay,
maybe this will be a quick question.
Okay.
That 4-dimensional graph showing the geographic and sexually disaggregated preferences just kind of dilutes everything. There were, to me, I was like, what would I choose? What would I choose? And if you were really empowering everyone to make their choice based on how they self-categorized, you would probably have 7, 8, or a dozen varieties you would have to keep in production instead of one. So ultimately, it comes down to having to pick a few. How do you honor the equity or quality of access issues you're trying to solve when it boils down to the actual labor of producing multiple varieties for many, many, many different constituencies?
That's a really good question. So that's one type of data, but there are many other ways you can come to that decision, right? So a lot of the times what's called a product profile, and that's description of an ideal variety, let's say, and all the characteristics that it has therein. Ultimately, you take that trait data, it's not like each of those rows is a different variety, right? You might find some overlap, and the ranges within those rankings are not that large. So you may find that you can start building what are called pipelines, right? You can start saying, okay, and there's different gender analysis tools that are coming out now for plant breeding that enable you to start saying, okay, do I need to add or take away traits based on some gender analysis of the ideal variety that I'm thinking about? So it's less about each of those kind of buckets being one variety and more about the diagnostic of looking to see if there's anything I'm missing, right? Is there a trait that's coming out strongly or weakly that I need to adjust when I'm making my priority settings? So it's the way that plant breeding works. You won't have more than 2 to 3 pipelines for each crop. I would say that's average for a crop for a country. So they would never accept something like that. And I would say that's where the pushback often happens is, oh, I can't breed for all of that. Don't throw all that complex data in front of me. But if you're able to say, okay, but look, there's something here, right? The poor and food insecure households in the Southeast, this trait is really important. Don't forget it, right? Put it in your essential traits that you're breeding for. So it's more of a kind of that's not the be all end all, but it's a source of information for you to feed back to the programs. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Sierra Versillo, she is actually our next discussion series speaker in about a month. So please, what is your question?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this presentation. I'm furiously writing emails and sending them off to people based on your findings, because it is interesting, some things I hadn't thought about. I guess it's a big question, but I was wondering if you could speak more about the bias of the industry of seed breeding and how that structural bias shapes sort of the gendered analysis and the gendered findings, the output of those findings, or how those findings are then used. And I'm just thinking about potentially the bias away from public breeding, from open pollination, and from the traditional systems that people share seed, especially when they're related to food and poverty in drought prone in all sorts of other areas. So I know it's a big question, but that those sort of structural issues, I think, are really important to consider in this analysis. Thanks.
Exactly. No, thank you. Thanks for the question. Right, there's two pieces to that puzzle. I think the structural and the historical, I would say that let me put it this way. The private sector multinational culture itself is problematic, and that coming into the public sector breeding programs itself is problematic. How the public sector programs have been structured themselves is not free of bias for sure. So what I would say is, yes, historically, you've seen a lot of pushback, I would say resistance, active resistance, or just ignoring data that's coming out, some of the gender analysis, some gender research, some of the red flags that have been raised over the years, I would say are mostly glossed over because, again, structurally, the programs are not ready to deal with that. And the people in charge are the ones who may be perpetuating some of those systems, right? So they don't really want to be challenged. So it's a challenge and opportunity. I would say I take it as an opportunity, this demand-led, market-led breeding, right? The framing of that being more demand-led actually, to me, has opened the door to some of us to say, hey, you want to talk about demand, you want to talk about market, you can't talk about that in isolation of these social dynamics, right? So that's going to be kind of an interesting way of challenging the public sector structure for food security breeding. Now, what you're talking about on the other end is open pollinated versus kind of hybrids. There, I think, in informal and formal seed systems, there's a lot of also seed systems interventions. That's the under half of the puzzle. I'm talking about plant breeding. You get to the variety, what happens with that variety. I'm also seeing a lot of worrying trends in terms of privatization of the seed systems, formalization of seed systems for a lot of these food security crops, which don't do any due diligence as they're scaling, right? And it's just like, oh, we just need more of this in private sector and more, and kind of just get the seed out there and everything will be fine. Counterbalanced by a lot of critical work saying, no, this is very dangerous and we can't be doing this. So I think, the structural inequalities in the seed system are pretty well documented, but who's reading them? I think that's an interesting thing, the people actually doing the work. Often I find when I raise some of these issues about seed systems, they're a bit taken aback. And I don't know if that's just because they're not exposed to that information, they haven't thought about it. A little bit of sensitization there, I think, goes a long way, but also there's another seed systems project that I'm involved in, presenting the evidence, right, within that context, I think is really important. So I haven't answered your question. The way I look at it is bite-sized challenges to the system work well, and collectively you kind of take a little bit of seed systems, a little bit of breeding, and you kind of build this case towards pointing out those biases through the pipeline, comes together and really does convince people, I find at least, not everyone, but the key decision makers, that's where the weakest point is. Yeah, so.
I just wanted to thank you for that answer, and I appreciate your optimism. I am thinking as a sort of the political economist, ecologist, of sort of the questions around whose demand is being recognized, and the exclusion if the goal or the aim underlying development seed breeding funding is to privatize and not necessarily to reduce poverty is I think a challenge. So I appreciate the framing of it as an opportunity for potential change.
Yeah, that paper I flagged, the Who's Demand paper, is really interesting for that. So there is more critical work happening in that space, and I think it's just slowly bringing that into the programs as a reflection point. So the way I look at it is like we're working with practitioners, and you can fundamentally question the system, but the way I look at it is you can work within the system to make those adjustments more gradually at the same time as generating the much more critical work that helps inform that. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your question and your discussion there. Hale, can I ask you to stay 10 more minutes?
Yeah, that's fine.
We have two questions. One is Mohammed Hasiber. I'm going to ask this person to unmute, introduce themselves, and then Keith Poe. Let's see.
Hello.
Mohammed?
Hello.
Okay, good.
This is Hasibur Rahman Hida. I am a plant pathologist and I am working in a research institute as a scientific officer. So I am working in disease-resistant variety development. So I am so interested to including gender responsive in my breeding program. So this is midnight in Bangladesh, and I am waiting for so much interested, so that I am waiting for your discussion. And this is gender responsive, and anyone can ask about what's about transgender. Anyone can ask. This is although it is a gender responsive breeding system, we are only discussion about female or male. And this is my question, and how we can reducing gender gap in our agriculture system. And it is I think it is devastating in this rural area. In African region, that women is 50-50 equality, I think, in their work. But in South Asia, but woman is dominated. They are so much dominated. So we need to explore in is rural area where they are working in or they are participated in agricultural system. And this is my question, and my some observation is gender transformation approach or gender transformative approach is so much needed for collective learning and participatory approach, and for qualitative and quantitative approach, so that women's empowerment is gained, and socio-cultural outcomes, nutritional outcomes, and agricultural livelihood outcomes is gained from this gender transformative approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think in your case, I mean, it's hard to answer that question right straight off. It's a big question, but what I try to do is what I'm seeing a lot within a lot of the countries that we work in. There are academic institutions where there is kind of pretty interesting critical research happening around women's rights and gender equality, but often those university settings and academic studies are not linking with the ag research centers. And I think that's another systematic issue, right? That those two ends of the spectrum are really not meeting. So in your case, I would think, who, or is there someone in country, because a lot of the issues would be highly contextual, that would need kind of further research and synthesis of knowing what the constraints and barriers and what the issues are before you can formulate an intervention. Who is doing work around gender and agriculture right here in Bangladesh? So there's been a history of work in gender and agriculture in Bangladesh. It's probably one of the most data rich and interesting places, really drawing on local expertise to ask some of those questions together, right? Partnering with someone in country who has that experience. And you're in a particularly advantageous position in Bangladesh because there's a lot of work that has happened over the years, and really kind of working together to formulate research to answer that question, and then see how that comes back to your breeding program. So I guess what I would advise you is just looking, and I don't know how you would do this, through informal networks or formal networks, to identify the right research partner. And then you can have a lot more long-term research together. And that's worked really well for other contexts where you do have that pairing of the in-country deep and knowledgeable social scientists with the plant breeding institutions coming together to do research. Yeah.
Okay, Keith, I'm happy to read your question, but if you don't mind, you're also welcome to unmute however you like and introduce yourself, please. Let's see, I don't hear you. I'm going to go ahead and read it in case there's a problem on your end with a mic or something. So Keith had written, I was wondering about the practicality of managing such a diverse geographical reach. I assume that needs plenty of resources, money, and time. Or does each geographical area have its own autonomy? Thanks for the question, Keith.
Yeah, just to make sure I'm understanding this, geographical reach in terms of the varieties being released, right? Is that, or does the geographical have its own autonomy? I need to understand the question a little bit more. So in terms of, if we're thinking about plant breeding products and the reach and understand the social heterogeneity within each country, that's a huge undertaking. I don't think we can convincingly say we have a command of all the countries and all sort of social heterogeneity therein. Usually what we try to do is start with, you know, I'm thinking, again, this is super oversimplistic and there's problems with that as well. Thinking of the crop that you're breeding for. Plant breeding happens mainly in silos of crops. You breed crop by crop. You don't necessarily breed for a farming system, you breed for a crop. So usually the way people start is, you know, the production zones where the highest production for that crop is where you kind of stratify your sampling. And then within that, look to see where there may be other limitations or other targeting. Maybe there's areas you haven't reached. So I would say we don't really go for nationally representative data collection. If you're thinking about data collection, if that's what the question was about. Oh, I see. You're on your map. You're all over Africa and Latin America. Okay, so so what you're asking there is working across different contexts. I mean, that's less problematic, I think, because we're not actually driving the research there. We're kind of working with the institutions, and each institution has its own team, and that was a part of the RFP, right? That there's real contextual research in each country. So we're not kind of going from country to country and designing research for anybody. We're more of a backstopping kind of support network, right? To see, can we help link people where they need to be linked, especially like the example I gave in Bangladesh. Sometimes there's no one on my team. How do I link with the right person? Can we start helping that happen? Sometimes we identify consultants in country, but really the research is highly contextualized and driven by the teams in country. So each team has its own autonomy. Yes, each team does its own research, agenda setting and design. That has worked somewhat well, really heterogeneous in some cases, but that's the nature of kind of how we designed it. So yeah, it can be really expensive and it can be really variable. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Am I still unmuted? Yes. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Many of you have stayed on another few minutes here with us, and thank you. Hale wrote me late last night saying she thought she had COVID. She was feeling very sick, and I was worried she would not be joining
My
us.
voice
today,
did not.
so thank you so much,
Thank
despite
you.
your recent long trip and not feeling well. You did a great presentation, and we had a really nice conversation. So I really appreciate that, and thank all of you for attending. As you know, as I've said, we got a short survey. Lumbini, maybe you can send it out again. And I went ahead and put in there the note for our final, in November 10th, we have Dr. Sierra Vestillo from the University of Waterloo, who will be presenting on a systematic review of literature, 260 studies published by the Web of Science on gender and climate change in Africa. So that's exciting. So look at our website. If you do add yourself to our listserv, we don't send anything out that isn't specifically gender and international development. You won't get spammed, I promise. So thank you very much. And I'll be back in touch with you, Hale, in a minute. And great, I appreciate all of you being here.
Thanks for the invite. Thanks for coming, everyone.